Okay, today we're going to be talking about the potato famine in Ireland. The potato famine can also be called the Great Potato Famine, the Great Irish Famine, or the Famine of 1845 through 1849. The famine began when there was a failure of growth of potatoes. The famine killed over 1 million men, women, and kids, and it caused 1 million people to flee the country. A little bit of background about Ireland during this time period. Life expectancy was 40 years for men. They tended to marry young girls at the age of 16 and boys at the age of 17 or 18. And they also tended to have large families. Most rural families lived in single room and a windowless cabin. Infant mortality was also quite high, and only about a quarter of the population could read or write. In the mid-1800s, Ireland was a dominant agricultural nation. It was populated by 8 million people who were amongst the poorest people in the Western world. In 1835, a British survey, according to the History Place, found half of the rural families in Ireland living in single-room, windowless mud cabins that didn't have chimneys. The people lived in small communal clusters known as clachans, and they were spread out amongst the beautiful countryside. Up to a dozen people would live in these cabins, and they would be sleeping on straw on the bare ground. The most fertile farmland was found in North and East Ireland. Potatoes were not native to Ireland, but likely came from the Andes Mountains of Peru. By the 1800s, the potato had become the staple crop for the poorest regions. By the 1840s, almost one half of the Irish population, especially the poor, had become dependent on the potatoes for their main diet. In 1845, as the leaves on the potato plant suddenly turned black and started rotting, which they thought was the result of a fog that came across the fields, it was actually the cause that was an airborne fungus called Phytophthora, which had arrived from North America on accident, traveling on ships that were coming from North America to England. That same year, Ireland had unusually cool, moist weather, which helped the blit to thrive across the region. After the summer of 1846, there was only enough potatoes to feed the people of Ireland for 1 month. Panic began to sweep the country. The potato failure in 1845 led to failure from 1846 to 1849. After the famine, Ireland's population of almost 8.4 million in 1844 fell to 6.6 million in 1851. So one question that we all have to ask ourselves is, what happened to these people and where did they go? So we're going to talk about the movement of the people that were affected by this potato famine in Ireland and where they ended up. About 1 million people died from starvation or from typhus and other famine-related diseases, and a number of the Irish immigrated during the famine, reaching almost 2 million people. Nearly 1 million Irish arrived in the United States. Most refugees were suffering and were poor. Immigrants settled in New York, Boston, and other cities. Some went to Australia and Great Britain. Most immigrants, however, traveled on Canadian coffin ships. These ships were not equipped for passenger travel. The landlords would simply say that they would pay for their four families to make it overseas to British North America, and they would tell them that once they landed that there would be promises of money, food, and clothing for the people waiting for them, and then they would pack them into these ships in really close quarters, and they were overcrowded, and a lot of these ships were poorly built. from Ireland to America. It was a 40-day journey across the Atlantic, and these ships were filled with men, women, and children of all ages. Landlords would pack the people into small ships that were not built properly and that were not seaworthy. From Ireland to Quebec, it was a 3,000-mile journey, and depending on the skill of the captain, it could have taken 40 days to 3 months for these ships to land in Canada. Upon the arrival of ships, they were to be inspected for disease. If they were quarantined, they were sent to hospitals and left to crawl if they could make it for a medical inspection. The quarantine efforts, however, were soon abandoned, and the Irish were sent on their way to their next destination without any medical inspection or treatment. The people that were sent to hospitals, they were ill with typhus and dysentery and eventually wound up in really makeshift hospitals. They were badly understaffed and unsanitary, and they became simply places for these people to die. There were corpses piled up in nearby mass graves, and those who couldn't make it to the hospital died along the way, along the roadsides. In one case, according to the History Place, in an article titled Coffin Ships, an orphan Irish boy was walking along the road with other boys, and he sat down for a moment under a tree to rest and just promptly died on the spot. So a lot of these people were sick due to the conditions of the travel. Of the 100,000 Irish that sailed to British North America in 1847, 1 out of the 5 died from disease and malnutrition, including over 5,000 at Grosse all. Half of the men that survived the journey traveled across the border to America to begin a new life. They viewed the United States as an anti-British tradition and its bustling young cities as a true land of opportunity to begin a new life. Many of them left their families behind in Canada until they had a chance to establish themselves in America. One way immigration was limited was to increase the price of crossing the border into America. Ports along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. required a bond to be posted by the captain of the ships to guarantee that the passengers would not come towards the city. Passenger fares in the U.S. in 1847 were up 3 times higher than the fares to Canada, so it was a lot cheaper. It was a lot cheaper for these refugees to get into Canada than it was for them to sail into America. During the famine, almost 500,000 Irish were evicted from their cottages from landowners and were forced to survive alone. So if they weren't put on a ship by their landowners, they were evicted from their cottages. One way that their landowners did this was to they applied for legal judgment against the male head of the family owing back rent, and then after they would pronounce this judgment, the man would be thrown into jail and his wife and children would be dumped out into the streets. A notice to appear was usually enough to cause most poor families to flee, and they were handed out by the hundreds. And that is it. That explains how the people that were involved in the Ireland potato famine, how they were affected by this potato famine for 6 years, and how that they dealt with getting out of Ireland and moving to either make something better of themselves and try to help their family to survive.